so that IT speaks the language of business, and that language is finance. So ratchet up your own skills and your department skills to be able to communicate more effectively the cost, and I think much more importantly, the value that you are delivering on behalf of the rest of the organization. And then lastly, there's only one customer, and that's the external customer. I think there's often this kind of language that's used in IT departments of the us versus them, IT versus the business. I'll refer to the business sometimes in my own presentation here. But also I think oftentimes thinking about the internal customer as the customer, when in fact customers are really the people who are providing revenue for your organization, value for your organization. I think there are profound implications to gearing the IT organization towards the end customer as well as the internal colleagues that you're serving with some sort of balance. So let's go into those. So some of the building blocks that to build a strong IT core, and this is actually taken from the book. Thank you so much for all the people who clapped who've read the book before. For those that didn't, shame on you. But so there are 5 principles that are introduced in the book itself. The first is people. I think the fundamental building block of the entire organization naturally is the people. What can you do without people naturally, as great as technology is? So making sure you have the right people in the right roles, making sure that you are anticipating the kinds of skills that are growing in importance, just as you're also evaluating what is decreasing in importance. And constantly judging that supply and demand of skills and talent, and also grooming the future leaders, identifying who are the people who are the more clever members of your team, the more dynamic thinkers, the more curious, those people who can take over for you eventually, and treating them accordingly, since of course IT departments tend to be a bit more transient by nature. Number 2, infrastructure. We refer to this as the on-off switch of the IT, or the on-off switch between the proactive versus reactive organization. If you think of infrastructure as the collection of your past decisions, the extent to which it's not up and available and doing what it's supposed to be doing, you're going to be focusing on the past. Whereas if it is doing all those things, if it is robust, if it is reliable, then you can begin to carve out more of your time and your team's time to think about the future. And that's really where value is created ultimately, needless to say. Number 3 is the governance principle. We refer to it as project and portfolio management. So making sure that you have a sound engine through which new capabilities can be brought to bear on behalf of your organization. And making sure that you are delivering things certainly first and foremost on time, on budget, on scope, the kind of traditional metrics, but also on value increasingly. I'll return to that message a couple times in this presentation. 4th is a relationship between, forgive me, IT and the business, IT and your colleagues outside of IT. And making sure that you have the kind of relationship where you are proactive, consultative, not just reactive and sort of stuck in that support mode that a lot of IT organizations unfortunately still find themselves in. And I think very important to note, in order to really achieve value in this 4th area, it's important that the first 3 be operating very well. And so there really is, although I've been asked by a lot of CIOs, why don't you begin with Principle 4? Isn't that really where any IT leader should begin? Absolutely. If you're new to your job, you should go out and talk to your colleagues, find out what's going well, find out where things can improve, and take corrective action accordingly. But without great people, without an infrastructure that is doing what it's supposed to do, and without a good governance lifecycle that is delivering capabilities for the rest of the organization, the credibility will not be there to truly capture the essence of what is there for Principle 4, IT and business partnerships. And then lastly, external partnerships. So much now is delivered through external partners, vendors, if you will, that it's really important to engage them correctly. There are too many companies that view vendors as fulfillers of work as opposed to potential sources of value. Ultimately, in fact, in some cases, sources of innovation. And not setting up these agreements, not identifying the right vendors to begin with, setting up those agreements appropriately to value, and then ultimately managing them so that you are achieving the appropriate value. You're not getting as much as you can out of those relationships. And then this is presented as a continuum, because if you do these 5 things well, all of a sudden it's an easier place to keep and to recruit great people, and thus sort of a virtuous cycle, if you will. And a couple of things that, just before I leave the page, obviously these are concepts, each of the 5 are not new things to you. The nuance really is that order. But the other thing that I'd like to call out is of the 5, there's only one really that is exclusively the domain of IT, and that's infrastructure. The other 4 you share with the rest of the organization. And the extent to which you can begin to build centers of excellence around these topics, the more IT can be kind of the the example that even some of the other parts of the organization will follow. We've seen this again and again, and it's really an energizing thing when IT takes responsibility for some of these things and doesn't worry so much that, well, the HR isn't really doing what we need to do from a people perspective, so I guess we got to wait for them to change their policies in order for us to more effectively manage our people. Well, that doesn't make sense. But unfortunately, a lot of organizations think that way. And so getting on top of these issues and recognizing that if things are not working well with the rest of the organization, and that's reflecting on how your practices are implemented, take corrective action yourself. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing so many CIO pluses or CIO squareds that are coming about, because they've done such great things in the IT department that people want them to do the same things elsewhere. Okay? I wanted to just briefly mention that there are 33 areas that are evaluated. The 5 now are at the head of these columns. Forgive me, people in the back. But the 5 principles I just introduced are on the head of the columns. There are 33 areas that we evaluate that are covered in the book that are underneath these. This is a kind of a genericized scorecard that we did for an organization, kind of showing how the evaluation process works and the maturity model, if you will, relative to these topics. But instead of taking the time now, as it is limited, to go through all 33, what I thought I would do was focus on just a few and think about, if you're to take these concepts, how do you begin? How do you begin to structure these things in order to ratchet up performance? So a few things in terms of those building blocks. First of all, define the present and the future states. Take responsibility for that. And that means, first of all, from a people perspective, developing a skill inventory. Who do you have? What skills do they have? What is the as-is of your organization? Likewise, workforce planning. What is the to-be of your organization? That should be based upon what you're learning from the rest of the company in terms of their strategies, about what 2 to 3 years from now look like for your business, as well as what's possible in terms of the institution of new technologies and so on. That ought to be, again, a key component of that supply and demand equation for people. Thirdly, meaningful evaluations. Who are your best people? Not knowing that obviously means that you're playing with less than a full deck of cards, and some of those great people are going to leave as a result of not being treated as they should be. From an infrastructure perspective, developing an infrastructure roadmap. I'm amazed how often we'll go into organizations and they don't know, they can't identify all of the hardware and software or applications that they are managing. If you're building new things, how are you assembling that into what's already there if you don't know what is already there? And likewise, of course, as you're growing and continuing to expand that footprint, what goes away by virtue of the new capabilities you're bringing to bear? You're only going to be adding the complexity of what you're managing if you don't have a solid infrastructure roadmap in place. And then in principle 4, IT business communications, making sure there's a sound flow of communication, not only at the senior-most level of IT and the rest of the organization, but more junior as well. I'm going to get into some concepts later in the presentation on that. IT and business strategic alignment, making sure that you are pressing the rest of the organization to define their strategies clearly with metrics associated with them. All too often, unfortunately, I often say that CIOs and IT leaders have the thankless task of receiving inputs through casual conversation, through email, through phone calls, through a very detailed plan from one business unit, from a pamphlet of esoteric information from another, and all this input needs to drive work, drive priorities. People and dollars need to be put to work based on all these varying level of inputs, and that's unfortunate. And so pressing the rest of the organization to do their job of creating plans that hopefully are longer in duration so you can understand what trends are emerging further out, but also that has a degree of clarity for you to understand where are there some commonalities here. That's another tremendous value IT can provide. Where is there a need that multiple parts of the organization are articulating that maybe they don't see, but by virtue of you having these conversations, you see? Again, a concept that I'll be talking about more as we go on. And lastly, IT strategy, making sure that you have a sound IT-specific strategy in place that certainly reflects what you're learning from the rest of the organization, but is getting ahead of their demand for new sorts of capabilities, new sorts of technologies, and so on. Secondly is strengthen the governance. And this is everything from the prioritization practices, having better portfolio management, better project management, and better vendor management ultimately. There's a real touch point between those two. There are a lot of organizations that will outsource to one vendor or another and hope that they bring with them great management practices, governance practices. That almost always is destined for underwhelming results. If you don't have great governance internally, it's going to be very difficult for you to manage now a much more difficult set of situations where you have internal and external resources that you've put to work. And so it's really important to get the internal practices in place before you get the external ones, and then continue to expand those. Thirdly, motivate the best employees. And this comes through compensation and recognition. Probably a very easy to understand topic, but recognition often not so much. How do people on your team want to be recognized? What are the things that motivate them? Understanding them a little bit more. It's not just money, I think you'll find if you have detailed conversations with them. Retention, making sure, especially in these times, as hopefully the economy continues to get better, and the downside of that, of course, is that companies will start to hire again. What are the things that your team is doing to make sure the best people stay with you?